There are many cultures represented in Canada, and it is part of our national pride that we work to maintain space in this country for diverse beliefs and customs to be freely expressed and lived out in peaceful relation to one another. However, what we often fail to realize is that the land itself expresses a culture all its own. Indigenous communities have an invaluable relationship to the physical landscape of Canada, and their beliefs and customs are not only predicated on the importance of their environment, but in fact proceed from its very characteristics. As occupants of this land, it should be within our prerogative to understand the nature of this relationship that characterized life here for so long before us. Sadly, instead the opposite has occurred. Rather than celebrate the culture of Indigenous people, efforts have been almost exclusively to wash it out. As a millennial, I have had some measure of exposure to a historical narrative that acknowledges the reality of oppression of First Nations people in this country. Beginning in the 1990s, the public's attention was drawn to the problem of residential schools. While improved awareness should be a step in the right direction for First Nations people, I find that the account of residential schools established by the Canadian media actually work to maintain a concrete distance between today's non-Indigenous population and the magnitude of violence in our own legacy. The memory of residential schools traumatized entire generations and influenced higher rates of family instability, mental breakdowns, and substance abuse. Rather than address the problem directly, social services propagated a plan that would spare the First Nations children from inheriting the trauma of their parents through removing them from their care and influence. However, this concept only recycled the same flawed logic by which residential schools were conceived of in the first place, perpetuating the same cycle of abuse while remaining discreet under the rationale that these actions were a recuperative measure for past harms. The term 60s scoop describes the particular span of child welfare work concerning First Nations children from 1960 to the mid-1980s. It was in this time that the most salient trends of forceful relocation took place. Youth were often removed from communities without the consent of their families and often without even a warning. The children were then placed in largely white households, but very few were adopted and most spent their lives in constant circulation and unrest. Many siblings were separated and some adoptees lost all contact with their families and residence communities. These descriptions, of course, align very closely with the experiences of residential school. In the early 1980s, 2 reports were initiated that exposed the criminality afoot in the program. The first was a statistical report by Patrick Johnson that revealed a disproportionate amount of cases in First Nations communities. The second, titled No Quiet Place, was a provincial review of the child welfare system in Manitoba, compiled by Judge Edwin C. Kimmelman in 1985. In it, Kimmelman makes a long list of suggestions, which expose just how flawed the system was and how many discrepancies are being swept under the table due to a pure lack of legislative responsibility. This year, the first public apology was issued for the 60s scoop in the province of Manitoba. In it, Premier Greg Selinger refers to this report, recalling in it a line that describes the removal of Indigenous children from their communities as cultural genocide, and reminds audiences that the residential schools were condemned in the exact same way. In doing so, Selinger establishes a connection between the traumas of residential school and the chain of misconduct that has proceeded from them, despite the nation's general condemnation of that particular event. By failing to also call attention to the equally irresponsible and comparably damaging way that child welfare services continue to treat First Nations cases, a notion has been established that these kinds of events are firmly in the past.